Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. In fiscal year 2013, New York City procured $16.5 billion with a B worth of supplies and construction services. But none of those dollars flowed into a New York City cooperative business. Why not? Well, that's a question raised by our next guest at a recent New York City Council hearing on the value of worker co-ops. Chris Michael is the executive director of the New York City network of worker cooperatives. It helps worker cooperatives get started and a whole lot more. If the city really wants to reduce inequality, he told the hearing, it would be smart to change some policies. Welcome to the program. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
So $16.5 billion. What could New York City's worker co-ops do with that kind of cash?
Well, certainly that could provide for thousands upon thousands of democratic jobs in the first place.
What do you mean by a democratic job? What does a dollar in a co-op do that's different from a dollar in a different kind of business?
Well, so in the first place, when a revenue or income is provided to a worker cooperative, it provides for a workplace or an environment where decisions are made democratically, where you don't have one class of individuals, namely investors, controlling the fates, the minds, the bodies of another class of individuals, i.e. the workers. Moreover, in very sort of narrow, dollar terms, right? When a dollar is paid into a worker cooperative, when you sort of consume a product or the services of a worker cooperative, that money is going to be divided equitably among the workers. So there are certain sort of hard decisions that need to be made about wages, for example. You might have somebody who's highly trained who sort of in our market demands a higher wage or higher salary. But then you also have decisions that are made about sort of end-of-year surplus or profits, and usually those decisions are made really quite sort of in a very immediate egalitarian fashion.
And you described a couple of worker co-ops when you spoke at the New York City Council hearing. Yeah. Here's a clip of what you had to say.
Okay. New York City can take an active hand in helping to incubate, create, provide the business planning, not just the financing, right? Not just an open door for somebody to sit down in a chair and get a pat on the back, but for New York City to provide a direct and active hand in doing the business planning, the foreplanning, the advanced planning to create these businesses, to then go to the workforce roles, to do the hiring, to hire the senior managers, the professionals that will also be necessary for a major construction business. We really have an opportunity to really make our mark here as far New York City Council. We have an opportunity to really set a new national standard. This really is something that's new. The Bay Area, Cleveland, Chicago, they're not doing what we're about to do.
There are conditions that make it easier or more difficult for co-ops to thrive. Yeah. Part of the point of the hearing was to flesh out what some of those might be. Yeah. What did you learn? What did you hope the council learned? Yeah. And, well, what do we know about what makes a city co-op friendly?
Sure. Well, I think the best example of a city that's co-op friendly is the city of Bologna in Italy, right? And in that city, about 80 to 90% of the social services that the city provides to its public are essentially contracted out through worker cooperative businesses. So right now, already in the United States, we have something, we call it third-party government. We have this incredible, vast system in which the government doesn't necessarily directly provide services to its citizenry, but actually contracts out and purchase. It doesn't form its own construction company, right? We don't have the construction company of New York City. Rather, we hire other construction companies to do the work for us. So, in the city of Bologna, the worker cooperative community has leveraged this to their advantage, and I think that we're perfectly capable of doing that here at home.
Tell us some more about New York City's co-ops. I mean, how many are there, and what kind of things do they do?
Sure. Well, in the first place, you can find a fantastic listing of the worker cooperatives here in New York City on our homepage, nycworker.coop, and there's a business directory. These are, after all, businesses.
Now, you make it sound like an enormous number, but last time I looked, it was like 23.
That's right. It's a very small number of worker co-ops, and there's still a very small number of worker co-ops nationally. So we have about, we have a sizable fraction of the U.S.'s worker co-ops are here located at home in New York City, but still a very burgeoning phenomenon.
So, but if they're so great, why are there so few of them?
Well, that speaks to all sorts of issues with regards to the culture here in the United States, education around business, state support for cooperative incubators and cooperative institutions like New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives.
So where do you think the biggest challenges lie for moving the needle on this question, getting us from 23 to, I don't know, 123 co-ops in the next few months?
Sure. Well, I think that this is certainly a multi-year vision. Fundamentally, what my organization advocates, and I think what worker cooperative, advocates nationally and internationally advocate, is really moving the conversation about our economy to a very different place. We're not merely advocating that it would be nice or it would be fun or it would be good to have worker cooperatives. We're arguing ultimately that this is sort of a moral imperative, that really every employee, every worker, every human being has a right to democracy in the workplace. Now, in terms of moving the conversation in that direction, that's going to take decades, maybe even centuries. In terms of taking some very bold steps in that direction, I can't think of a better thing than the conversation that we're having right now with New York City Council, with New York City Economic Development Corporation, with New York City Small Business Services Department, and thinking about the ways in which we can integrate our democratic government with building democratic businesses.
Why is this conversation coming up as it is right now?
Well, I think that progressives, sort of writ large, have had a major victory with Mayor de Blasio. So I think that we're seeing a real, city council, city government is really receptive to these ideas in a way that they likely wouldn't have been under previous administrations.
And the data that you point at to suggest that co-ops are a rational and effective response to the inequality that we see in our society?
So purely in terms of numbers, right? So you have on the one hand, right, you have just sort of, one need not necessarily have, but one might have a sort of a moral impetus or a moral feeling that humans shouldn't be rented out by other humans, right? That humans should democratically control their own businesses in partnership with their fellow workers. Now, in economic terms, you see around the world, internationally, certain ethical standards which are in place in worker cooperatives. And those ethical standards generally insist upon an approximately 8-to-1 ratio between the highest paid employee, say, let's call that person the CEO of the company, and the lowest paid person in the firm. Of course, those are radically different numbers than we are really conditioned to accept as normal here in the United States, where we have a ratio of at least 475 to 1, if not higher, in the last fiscal year. And there's, of course, a very good reason why worker cooperatives are allowed to impose an ethical standard which allows for an 8-to-1 pay ratio, and that's because they're democratically controlled by their workers.
Final questions. I was just in Chicago, where I've
wonderful.
been covering the story of the what used to be the Republic Windows and Doors factory, now the New Era Windows.
Yeah.
I saw them. They're set up. The place is beautiful.
Yeah.
They need business.
Yeah.
And they are very hard up for contracts in a global economy.
Yeah.
They are undercut on every front.
Yeah.
What makes you believe that a co-op can function in a capitalist economy?
Sure. So on the one hand, we have concrete examples of firms like the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation with 80,000 members or worker members, and they've been competing quite successfully in the global capitalist marketplace for decades now, making everything from, racing bicycles to home pressure cookers that you make food with. On the other hand, the realities of the competitiveness of the global capitalist marketplace, there's something that worker cooperators, people who believe in a democratic economy, have to sort of reckon with, and it's precisely for that reason that I think that it's extremely important that we start to look at what can be done with public spending. The city should clarify that worker cooperatives are an extremely important tool to combat economic inequality, that worker cooperative businesses are treated as given sort of preferred contractor status, and ultimately that contracting targets are set every year and hopefully incrementally those targets increase, but that every year 5% or 10% or 20% and maybe one day 100% of city spending will have to be channeled through worker cooperative democratic businesses.
Not to do anybody any favors, but simply if you've stated as your goal reduction of inequality and poverty, it's one effective way to go.
Yes.
I've got to ask you, as you mentioned Mondragon and its success, there is the more depressing news that in a global economy, their biggest factory, and it's a network of factories, but Fagor declared bankruptcy. Does that ruin your argument?
I don't think in the slightest bit. I mean, as far as I understand, about half of those employees of Fagor have already been brought in as employees in other parts of the company. Mondragon is an incredibly dynamic, democratically run business, and you know, that's part of life. It's part of business. It's part of human need, right? We no longer want flip phones, we want iPhones. So if the flip phone division gets shut down, well, then you bring those workers into, you know, the smartphone division. So I don't really think ultimately it's any kind of large problem.
All right, so look ahead, last question, look ahead 5 years, or take 10, I'll be generous.
Oh, give me 10.
What do you want to see in place in this city? Whether it's anchor institutions or new protected markets for co-ops or new educational possibilities and training, new property perhaps. What do you want to see that would leave you to think your work had been well done?
I think the number one thing that could be achieved in the next 10 years would be that we've established certain contracting goals on the part of the city, that those contracting goals are set in a progressive manner to increase over time, and to complement those contracting targets, that the city is providing money, financing, and resources to develop businesses tailored to those contracting goals.
All right, good. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
More information about the network at our website.